The most humiliated nation in Europe in 1672 was also the one that would deal the Ottoman Empire one of its most catastrophic military defeats in under 48 hours. And almost nobody outside Eastern Europe knows it happened. Think about what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth looked like in the autumn of 1672. Its greatest fortress had fallen without a real siege. Its king had signed a treaty so degrading that the Polish parliament refused to ratify it. It was paying tribute, gold, sent annually to Istanbul, like a vassal bowing to a sultan. Its treasury was empty. Its nobility was at war with itself. Foreign diplomats were already writing the eulogy. And then, 14 months later, a Polish commander led 30,000 men through freezing mud, attacked an entrenched Ottoman army of 35,000 in November, a month when no sane European general fought, and by nightfall of the second day, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Ottoman soldiers were dead, drowned, or captured. The army that had broken Poland was obliterated, and the man who did it was elected king 2 days after the battle ended. That is not the story of a lucky campaign. That is the story of a system. A methodology of war so precise, so brutally effective, that it turned national humiliation into national resurrection in under 2 years. The man behind it was John Sobieski. And what he did at Khotyn in November 1673 deserves to be ranked among the greatest military achievements of the 17th century. This video is about what actually happened on those frozen plains above the Dniester River, and why it changed the direction of history. By the end of it, you will understand not just what Sobieski did, but how he did it, and why the conventional understanding of this battle misses the most important part of the story. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the tactics, the terrain, the blood, and the brilliance behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard by people who actually want to understand it. And that is exactly what we're going to do right now. To understand how extraordinary Khotyn was, you need to understand just how broken the Commonwealth was before it. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-17th century was an anomaly in European politics. It was not a monarchy in the traditional sense. The king was elected by the nobility, a class so fiercely independent that they had given themselves the legal right to paralyze any decision in parliament with a single vote. It was called the liberum veto. One man could stand up and say no, and the entire legislative session dissolved. What sounds absurd in theory was catastrophic in practice. The Commonwealth had the military potential of a great power and the political coordination of a committee that couldn't agree on the bill. Into that structural disaster came the Cossack rebellions of the 1640s and 1650s, then the Swedish invasion, a period the Poles called the Deluge, and then Russia pressing from the east, and then a simmering conflict with the Ottoman Empire building along its southern frontier for years. By the time the 1670s arrived, the Commonwealth had been at war, on and off, for 3 decades. Its treasury was perpetually empty. Its armies were perpetually undersupplied. Its political class was perpetually divided. In 1671, the situation along the southern border reached a breaking point. The Cossack hetman Petro Doroshenko, desperate to find protection against both Poland and Russia, placed himself under Ottoman suzerainty. This was the kind of invitation the Ottoman Empire did not need to be given twice. The Sultan had a pretext, an ally, and an enormous army. He used all 3. In the summer of 1672, Sultan Mehmed IV led an Ottoman force that contemporaries estimated at over 100,000 men into Polish territory. The goal was straightforward: compel the Commonwealth to acknowledge Ottoman supremacy in the contested Ukrainian lands, once and for all. The opening move was the siege of Kamieniec-Podilskyi, the most fortified city in the Polish East, a place built on a natural rock peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by the Smotric River, considered by its defenders virtually impregnable. It fell in 1 week. The garrison was not incompetent. The fortifications were not poorly designed. The city fell because the Ottoman force was simply too vast, too well supplied with artillery, and because no Polish relief army arrived. After Kamieniec, the road was open. The Ottomans moved further north. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, its army scattered, its leadership fractured, entered into negotiations. The result was the Treaty of Buxacs, signed in October 1672. It is difficult to overstate how devastating this document was to Polish national identity. The Commonwealth surrendered Podolia, the fertile province built around Kamieniec, to direct Ottoman control. It ceded the Bratislav region and much of the southern Ukrainian frontier to the Ottoman-aligned Cossack state, and it agreed to pay 22,000 ducats annually as tribute. A tributary state. That is what Poland-Lithuania became, on paper, in October 1672. A nation that had fought the Teutonic Knights, beaten Russia, held off Sweden, pushed the Mongol successor states for generations, now sending gold to Istanbul as a sign of submission. The Polish parliament, refused to ratify the treaty. It was too humiliating. But refusing to ratify was not the same as having the military strength to repudiate it. That required something else entirely. That required John Sobieski. Sobieski in 1672 was 52 years old, which in 17th century military terms meant he was in his prime. He had been fighting since his 20s. He had studied war at close range, not in academies, but on actual battlefield against Cossacks, Tatars, Russians, and Swedes. He understood cavalry in a way that very few commanders in Europe did, because he had grown up in a military culture where the winged hussar was the dominant weapon system. But he was not nostalgic about it. He understood that the hussar alone, magnificent as it was as an instrument of shock warfare, could not win a modern campaign against an empire that had artillery, fortifications, and nearly unlimited infantry reserves. The Commonwealth needed something more flexible, more composite, a force that could hit hard and also absorb punishment. Sobieski spent the months between the fall of 1672 and the late summer of 1673 doing something almost no one in his position thought was possible. He rebuilt the Commonwealth's army from the ground up, while simultaneously managing a political environment that wanted to fight him as much as it wanted to fight the Ottomans. He had wanted 43,000 men. He got approximately 30,000. But those 30,000 were different from what the Commonwealth had fielded before. Western-style infantry, drilled in the linear tactics that had revolutionized European warfare, armed with flintlock muskets and plug bayonets. A compact but effective artillery train, including heavy field guns capable of destroying earthworks at medium range. And the winged hussars reorganized and resupplied, ready to operate in coordination with the infantry rather than as an independent arm. The financing was as ingenious as the tactics. Sobieski received a letter from the Ottoman Grand Vizier demanding Poland fulfill the Buxacs obligations. Instead of filing it away, he read it aloud before the Sejm. The message landed like a hammer. Delegates who had been squabbling over tax policy were suddenly confronted with the physical reality of what submission meant. A letter from Istanbul telling them when to pay and how much. The Sejm voted new taxes within days. Pride is a powerful funding mechanism. Then came the rout of March, which was itself a tactical decision. Sobieski moved his army along secondary roads, avoiding the main routes the Ottoman intelligence network monitored. He kept his column tight and fast, moving at a pace that exhausted his men but preserved the element of surprise. When the Polish army finally appeared near Khotyn in early November 1673, the Ottoman commander Hussar Pasha had very little time to adjust his dispositions. Here is what Sobieski was walking into. The fortress of Khotyn sat on a high plateau above the Dniester River, commanding the crossing and the road that ran between Central Europe and the Balkans. It was not a new fortress. It had been the site of a famous battle in 1621 when a Polish Cossack army had held off an Ottoman force and negotiated an honorable peace. The old earthworks from that engagement were still partially visible, and Hussar Pasha had used them as the foundation for his defensive network, reinforcing the old trenches with new earthen ramparts and wooden palisades. He had approximately 35,000 men inside those defenses. He had high ground. He had the river at his back as both a water source and an escape route via pontoon bridges. And he had every reason to believe that a Polish army attacking fortified positions in November would bleed itself white against his walls and eventually retreat. Husssein Pasha was not a fool. He was making a perfectly rational calculation. He simply did not account for Sobieski. The Polish army arrived outside Khotyn on the 9th of November, 1673, after 2 days of marching through conditions that would have halted most European forces. The roads had turned to mud that grabbed a horse hooves and sucked boots off soldiers' feet. A cold front was moving in from the north and east, bringing sleet and wind. The men were exhausted, but Sobieski moved them into position immediately rather than resting. He understood that every hour the Ottomans had to observe and adjust was an hour they used to strengthen weak points he might otherwise exploit. He sent out scouts and light cavalry to probe the Ottoman perimeter. He wanted to know where the earthworks were thinnest, where the garrison density was lowest, and whether Husssein Pasha could be drawn into open ground where Polish cavalry would have the advantage. Husssein Pasha could not be drawn. He kept his men behind the walls and let the weather do part of his work for him, knowing that the cold and mud punished an attacking force more than a defending one. The first day ended with skirmishing and artillery exchanges. Nothing decisive, both sides feeling the other out. The Poles lost some men in a probing infantry action. But that action gave Sobieski exactly what he needed: a map of the weak points in the Ottoman trench line, drawn in blood but usable. That night, while the Ottomans assumed the Poles were treating their wounded and debating retreat, Sobieski's engineers did something extraordinary. In temperatures below freezing, under sleet, in darkness, they advanced to within 200 meters of the Ottoman front line and built new artillery emplacements. 200 meters. The length of 2 football fields. They drove stakes into frozen ground and moved cannon through mud that had turned to ice. They worked in silence, knowing that a single shout, a single drop tool clanging against a frozen cartwheel, could bring a janissary volley down on them. By the time the Ottoman Dawn Watch took their positions, the Polish guns were already aimed. But nature was also at work that night, and it was working for Sobieski. The cold snap that arrived on the 9th deepened severely by the evening of the 10th. The temperature fell hard. The ice on the Dniester groaned, and the troops who suffered most were the ones least prepared for a Polish November. The Moldavian and Wallachian contingents, men from warmer climates, huddled in thin tents that gave almost no protection from the wind. Their officers reported sections of the trench line going unmanned in the small hours of the morning because the men had abandoned their posts and gone looking for fire and warmth. The Ottoman sentries on the northern face of the camp were the thinnest they had been at any point in the siege. Sobieski's scouts reported this before midnight. He made his decision within the hour. The assault began before dawn on the 11th of November, 1673, under a sky still dark and a horizon only beginning to gray in the east. The opening move was the artillery. The guns Sobieski's engineers had dragged through the frozen mud to within 200 meters of the Ottoman walls opened fire at nearly point-blank range. The noise was different from a normal bombardment, closer, sharper, more personal, and the effect was immediate. Ottoman earthworks that had been designed to withstand fire from several hundred meters away were hit by a shot that arrived before the defenders could process the sound. Ramparts crumbled. Wooden palisades exploded into splinters. The sections of the trench line that had been most thinly manned because of the cold were the sections that received the heaviest fire. In the chaos of the opening barrage, the Polish infantry went forward. These were not the old-style Polish foot soldiers of the previous generation, men who fought at close quarters with pikes and cold courage. These were drilled, disciplined musketeers, men who knew how to move in coordinated lines and keep firing even under return fire. They crossed the ground between the artillery positions and the Ottoman trenches while the defenders were still stunned and disorganized, and they hit the first line before the janissaries inside could form a coherent response. The fighting in the trenches was brutal and short. The Poles had axes and they used them, not just as weapons but as tools, tearing down sections of the earthwork to widen the breach, pulling down palisade stakes to open gaps for the next wave. The Janissaries in this section fought hard. These are not the conscripts from Moldavia who had abandoned their posts for warmth. These are the empire's elite infantry, men who had served for years and knew what defeat meant. They held for several minutes. Then the second Polish wave came through the breach, and the trench section was taken. General Marcin Kacki, commanding the Polish artillery, kept the guns firing even as the infantry went in, shifting the barrage to hit the Ottoman second line and prevent reinforcement. It was a level of fire coordination that most European armies of this period could not achieve. The Ottoman command structure, already struggling to communicate across a large fortified camp in conditions of darkness and cold and shock, began to fragment. Then came a sound. Every soldier in that camp who had fought the Commonwealth before knew that sound. Every Ottoman veteran who had faced the Polish heavy cavalry on open ground associated it with the worst moments of their military lives. It was the thunder of the Hussars at full gallop, and it was coming from the north. The winged Hussars hit the Ottoman left flank at the moment when the infantry breach was widening and the garrison was pulling men from the flanks to plug it. The Hussars did not need a wide breach. They needed an opening, and the infantry had given them one. They went through it like a spear through cloth. The charge of the winged Hussars at Khotyn has been described by eyewitnesses in terms that strain credibility until you understand the physics of what the formation actually represented. A fully armored Hussar on a heavy destrier weighed something in the range of 5 to 600 kilograms at impact. A formation of Hussars riding knee to knee at full gallop created a wall of kinetic force that no infantry formation of this period could stop in the open. The wings mounted on their backs, constructed of eagle and ostrich feathers on carved wooden frames, created a rushing, moaning sound as the horses accelerated that witnesses described as terrifying on a physiological level, the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and hit the fear centers of the brain directly. The Janissaries on the Ottoman left flank had not yet recovered from the artillery barrage. They were trying to reinforce the northern breach. They were cold. Some of them were already moving in response to orders that no longer made sense given what was happening 50 meters to their right. And then the Hussars were among them. The battle on the Ottoman left lasted minutes before it became a rout. Not because the Janissaries were cowards. They were not. But because the conditions for organized resistance had been systematically eliminated before the Hussars arrived. The artillery had disrupted the command structure. The infantry breach had pulled the reserve. The cold had reduced the sentries. Sobieski had not simply attacked. He had, over 2 days of careful observation and 1 night of frozen preparation, assembled a set of conditions where the attack could not fail. What followed the collapse of the Ottoman left was not a battle. It was a disaster in the classical military sense, the kind of rapid, cascading disintegration that happens when an army loses cohesion faster than its officers can restore it. Hussein Pasha attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal. He was a competent commander, and he understood that the critical asset was the pontoon bridges over the Dniester, the only route of organized retreat for 35,000 men. If those bridges could be held while the army extracted itself, the losses would be painful, but the force would survive. He sent orders. The orders arrived too late, or not at all, or were received by units that were already in motion in the wrong direction. The collapse happened first at the northern end of the Ottoman camp, where the Hussars were operating. Men began to move toward the river, not in formation, not under orders, but in the instinctive, terrifying compression of a crowd that knows it is surrounded and has one exit. The Moldavian and Wallachian contingents, whose loyalty to the Ottoman cause had always been conditional, were the first to break entirely. They did not fight. They ran. The Tatar cavalry, who should have formed the Ottoman mobile reserve and screened a retreat, found themselves in the worst possible terrain for their style of fighting. The frozen mud that had softened the earthworks and disrupted the Ottoman sentries was also lethal to fast cavalry maneuver. Horses slipped. Charges lost cohesion before they built momentum. The Tatars, who had spent their careers fighting on the open steppe where their speed was an almost unanswerable advantage, found that in November mud above the Dniester their greatest asset had been neutralized. They pulled back. Some fled directly. Sobieski, watching from the high ground with his cavalry commanders, made one of the most important decisions of the battle at this moment. Rather than allowing the pursuit to be disorganized, rather than letting his cavalry scatter into the countryside, chasing individual fugitives, he directed the Hussars to press the Ottoman camp itself and drive the fleeing soldiers toward the river. The objective was not to kill every man. The objective was to keep them moving toward those bridges. Because what Sobieski understood, and Hussein Pasha was only now realizing, was that a panicked army of 35,000 men trying to cross pontoon bridges simultaneously was not an army anymore. It was a disaster waiting for a catalyst. The Polish artillery provided the catalyst. Katsky's gunners shifted their angle of fire toward the bridge approaches. They began hitting the choke points, the narrow paths through the earthworks that led to the crossing, the approaches to the bridge itself, the crowded banks of the Dniester where men and horses were pressing against each other in the desperate mathematics of escape. Iron shot fell into the mass of men. Horses screamed. The bridge began to sway under the weight of thousands of panicked soldiers, horses, wagons, and cannon. The engineers who had laid those bridges had not designed them for this. They collapsed. Men went into the Dniester in November. The water was close to freezing. The current was fast. Heavy armor, which had been protection an hour ago, became an anchor. Those who could not shed their equipment drowned quickly. Those who shed it and tried to swim across in the cold found that hypothermia worked faster than they expected. The Ottoman soldiers who did not reach the bridges in time turned to fight. Some surrendered. Some tried to disappear into the countryside and were caught by Polish cavalry patrols in the hours and days that followed. Hussein Pasha himself survived, one of the relatively few senior Ottoman commanders to emerge from Khotyn intact, though the army he had commanded was, in the most literal military sense, destroyed as a fighting force. When the accounting was done, when the bodies on the frozen plain were counted and the prisoners were registered and the dead in the river were estimated, the scale of what had happened became clear even to people who had not been there. The Ottoman force at Khotyn had numbered somewhere between 30 and 35,000 men. The most careful modern historians put the Ottoman losses at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 killed, drowned, and captured. Even at the conservative end, 20,000 out of 35,000, the loss rate was catastrophic. Over 50%. More likely, the actual number was closer to the upper end of that range. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth lost approximately 2,000 men over both days of fighting. In a battle of this scale, a 2,000 casualty figure for the attacking side is extraordinary. It reflects the effectiveness of Sobieski's preparation, the artillery emplacement, the identification of the weak points, the coordination between infantry and cavalry, and also the brutal arithmetic of what happens when a defending force loses cohesion. Once an army breaks, it stops inflicting casualties. It simply receives them. The mathematical ratio, 10 to 1, 15 to 1 by some calculations, puts Khotyn in a category of military engagements that historians treat with some skepticism, because lopsided victories of this scale are genuinely rare. But Khotyn was real, and the ratio was real, and the reasons for it were not miraculous. They were tactical, logistical, meteorological, and above all, human. One man understood what was possible in those conditions. The other man did not. The news reached Warsaw while the Polish nobility was in the middle of deciding who would be their next king. Michael Korybut Wisniewicki, the reigning monarch, had died on the 4th of November, 1 week before the battle. The timing was, depending on your view of history, either a coincidence or a symmetry too perfect not to notice. A king died, and a victory was born, and they were 1 week apart. The delegates in Warsaw were a fractious, suspicious, provincial group of men who had spent their careers defending their estates and their privileges against exactly the kind of strong central authority that a successful military commander represented. They were not predisposed to hand power to a grand hetman who had just won a stunning victory, because stunning victories created exactly the kind of popular mandate that threatened their autonomy. Under ordinary circumstances, Sobieski would have had powerful enemies in that room. These were not ordinary circumstances. The couriers who arrived from Khotyn carried numbers. 20,000 Ottomans dead. 35,000 enemy soldiers reduced to flight and drowning and capture. The fortress retaken. The humiliation of Bucksacks avenged. In 48 hours, the delegates read those numbers and understood that the man who had produced them was not just a general. He was the reason there was still a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to hold an election in. On the 13th of November, 1673, 2 days after the battle, John Sobieski was elected King of Poland. It remains one of the most direct connections in European history between a military victory and a political outcome. The battle created the king. What Sobieski did with that kingship, including his role at Vienna in 1683, commanding the coalition force that drove back the largest Ottoman army ever to threaten Central Europe, is a different story. But Vienna does not exist without Khotyn. The coalition of 1683 does not coalesce around a Polish king without the legitimacy that Khotyn created. The history of Central Europe in the late 17th century runs through that frozen plateau above the Dniester River, through those 2 days in November when a broke, humiliated, fractured nation decided it was not finished. For the Ottoman Empire, the consequences of Khotyn were structural. The Janissaries were the cornerstone of Ottoman military power, the elite infantry corps that had made the empire's expansion possible over 3 centuries of conquest. Their reputation for invincibility was not merely propaganda. It was based on a genuine record of performance across an enormous range of opponents and environments. At Khotyn, that reputation fractured. Not because the Janissaries fought badly, the ones who held their positions in the northern trench line fought as hard as trained soldiers could fight under those conditions, but because thousands of them were killed or drowned in a rout they could not stop. The news that spread through the empire was not nuanced. It said that the Janissaries were beaten by the Poles. In 2 days, the vassal states along the northern frontier, Moldavia and Wallachia, drew their own conclusions. Ottoman protection had been the reason to accept Ottoman suzerainty. If the Ottomans could not protect themselves, the case for submission became substantially weaker. The loyalty of those provinces, never deep, became shallower after Khotyn. The major Ottoman offensive operations in Central Europe paused for several years after 1673. The empire did not collapse. It was too large and too resilient for a single defeat to produce that outcome. But the momentum that had produced the fall of Kamieniec-Podilskyi and the Treaty of Bucksacks did not continue unchecked. History has a bias towards scale and spectacle. Vienna in 1683 had both. The largest relief force assembled in Europe since the Crusades. The rescue of the Habsburg capital from a siege that had lasted 2 months. The image of Sobieski's cavalry descending from the Kahlenberg in the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. Vienna had everything that makes for a compelling historical narrative, and it has been told and retold for 340 years. Khotyn had cold mud, a collapsed bridge, and 10,000 Moldavians who abandoned their posts to find a fire. But strip away the spectacle and look at the outcomes. Vienna confirmed that the Ottoman Empire could not take Central Europe. Khotyn demonstrated, for the first time in this era, that the Commonwealth could destroy an Ottoman army in the field under adverse conditions. Vienna was a coalition victory. Khotyn was a Polish victory, achieved with Polish resources under Polish command against a force that held every theoretical advantage. Sobieski at Khotyn was operating without allies, without adequate funding, with an army 25% smaller than he had requested in November against entrenched defenders. He won by a factor of 10. The man who pulled that off deserves to be remembered not just as the king who saved Vienna, but as the commander who, before Vienna was even imaginable, proved that the Ottoman military machine could be broken. The fortress of Khotyn still stands above the Dniester River. It has been incorporated into modern Ukraine. You can walk the walls where the Janissaries made their stand. You can look down at the river where the bridges collapsed. The plateau is quiet now, as battlefields usually are, with the grass growing over ground that absorbed an enormous amount of what November 1673 produced. Khotyn deserves better than footnote status. It was the moment when a nation that had been written off decided it was not finished. When a commander who had been given too few men, too little money, and too difficult a season converted those disadvantages into a tactical plan that left an enemy army without enough soldiers to retreat in good order. When a battle so decisive happened that the parliament watching from Warsaw had no real choice but to make the man who won it their king. 2 days, 30,000 enemy casualties. A treaty annulled not by negotiation but by total military destruction. A general elected monarch before the bodies were counted. If that is not a story that deserves to be remembered, then nothing is.